y'all, I'm Dan Hamilton, Marine Corps veteran and host of the Next Gen Warrior Show. As always, the Next Gen Warrior Show is brought to you by Chairman George P. Bush and our dedicated staff here at the Texas Veterans Land Board. Here at the Next Gen Warrior Show, we are proud to promote the continued service and leadership of veterans after they take off the uniform and return to their communities. And I don't think anybody knows more about that than our next guest today. He is a Marine Corps Scout Sniper veteran, as well as the co-founder and CEO of Team Rubicon, an international disaster response organization. Jake, it's great to have you on the program today. How are you?
I'm doing well, Dan. How are you doing?
I am good. I'm excited to jump into not only your work with Team Rubicon, but as well as your book, Once a Warrior. But before we get to both of those big subjects, tell us about why you decided to join the Marine Corps.
Yeah, I think I'd always been interested in joining the Marine Corps, certainly joining the military. Growing up, I was like many young boys, always any stick I picked up became a sword or later a rifle, and watched all those movies, and really gave some earnest thought to joining the military while I was in high school. Explored possibly going to the service academies. Ended up instead going to college to play football, which I'm sure any of your audience members in Texas can appreciate. And so I went to the University of Wisconsin on a football scholarship. And my football career did not turn out to be what I had hoped it would be. I certainly had aspirations of playing professionally. Those were dashed fairly early in my career.
Why was that?
Go ahead.
Why was that?
Well, I think probably lacking some talent that would have been required, but also lacking some durability. I had a bunch of injury issues. Both my shoulders got reconstructed. I had a foot injury. I kind of joke that I was made of glass.
Body started falling apart, huh?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's hard to imagine I even made it into the Marine Corps from there. But, that was okay. I was not the guy on the team that was putting all of my eggs in the professional sports basket. I was a good student. I was on track to graduate, but I was in college during 9/11 and watched us go to war in both Afghanistan and then Iraq. And so when the time came for me after I'd played my last game and I had to figure out what I was actually going to do with my life, I kind of revisited that desire to serve, and so I ended up enlisting in the Marine Corps.
I actually want to go back a second and stay on the path of football, because I'm always interested in the connection between sports and the military, the team camaraderie, the mission side of it, as well as the physicality of it. And we were sitting down with Jesse Wougier, and he is a surface warfare officer. He's a NASCAR driver. And he talked about when he was playing free safety for the Naval Academy, he talked about walking out of the tunnel at Ohio State, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And just the intensity of the moment, how fun it was. Do you have a memory that is something like that, of just when everything that is college football, and especially at such a big program like Wisconsin, where it just hits you all at once and you go, wow, this is really cool?
Well, yeah, and I know Jesse. He's a great guy. And I have this, of course, the same experience. I played a night game at Ohio State once. Both of our programs were ranked in the top 5. I think it was Ohio State's homecoming.
Wow.
And, that is a really epic stadium and place to play. And honestly, in the fourth quarter, it was a tight game. I remember on third down, you couldn't even hear yourself think. You certainly, the offensive lineman, I played offensive line, nobody could hear anybody else above the crowd noise. It was actually painful. The crowd noise was so loud on the field. But I would say that my truly, this is amazing moment also was against Ohio State, but it was at home. It was the year prior, maybe 2 years prior. And Ohio State was coming off their national championship win. They had a 20 or 21 game winning streak, and we played them in a night game at our stadium. And with probably 5 minutes left in the game, our backup quarterback, because our starter got injured in the third quarter, threw a 79-yard touchdown pass to Lee Evans for the go-ahead touchdown. And it was just, that stadium has never rocked
pandemonium.
Louder. Oh, total pandemonium. And that was I wasn't in the game, but being down on the field for that moment was just unbelievable. And, it was pretty fun afterward out on the town.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I can't imagine. It kind of gives me chills just thinking about it and being down there. My football career ended pretty unceremoniously in high school with the cracked collarbone. And so I just live in vicariously through you and Jesse hearing these great stories.
Yeah, no, you raised the point about the parallels between sports and the military. And, I think there's some people who kind of, people from the military who get, all bristled up about comparisons between athletics and in the, in the military service. And I think those people need to get over themselves. There are plenty of parallels, and sports certainly do prepare you for time in the military. And I'm not one of those people that get insulted when people
Too offended.
talk about being in the trenches or anything like that. I mean, it's a hard job. It's a grind. And I would take the vast majority of guys I played with at Wisconsin, I would have gone to war with. And they would have been pretty damn good Marines.
No, I certainly, I kind of second that notion, because I do think that this isn't something that I guess we've necessarily explored on the show, but Nate Boyer and the guys over at Emerging Vets and Players, I think there's a similar mentality that you see from veterans who leave the service. And I think you talk about it a little bit in your book. When you lose that team mentality, when you lose the mission, and all of a sudden everybody who's counting on you, you no longer have that responsibility. I know, as you said, maybe it's a little bit different arena, but for athletes who are playing at the highest level and they fill stadiums every night, and they're going to, like you said, going to war with their buddies, and they're so good at something for such a long period of time that when they also take off the uniform, even if it's just a sports uniform, there is some sort of parallel, I think, between the veteran experience leaving the military and those, like you said, high-performing athletes when they leave and have to go kind of walk the same walk that we do, which is kind of to learn to, where do you fit into a society? How do you learn a new set of skills? And where do you bring value to your community after that experience?
Yeah. I think there's no doubt. I saw it plenty of times. A lot of my teammates went on to go play in the NFL, and some of them took that adjustment to life after football better than others. But I think that you're right. The parallels are there, and we shouldn't be afraid to draw them.
Yeah. So let's pivot here a little bit to the great work that Team Rubicon has done. And if I can go to August of 2017, at that time I was working for U.S. Congressman Michael McCall, and we were watching Hurricane Harvey come into the Gulf and just absolutely batter the Gulf Coast of Houston. It goes back out into the Gulf and then comes back inland. And it was one of the most catastrophic storms that the people in Texas, especially the people on the Gulf Coast, have experienced here. But one of the things that I will never forget from that is I then transitioned to be special assistant to Commissioner Bush here at the Texas General Land Office. And we spent loads of time down there. Our community development and revitalization team has spent time down there working on the long, short, and midterm housing mission. Is that Team Rubicon was there from, I think, day one. I know what it looked like from our perspective here at the GLO as we tried to house people, as Commissioner Bush went down there to muck and gut houses. Can you tell us what it looked like from your perspective? And if I'm not mistaken, you guys have an ongoing mission still in Houston.
Yeah, that's right. We are still in Houston rebuilding homes. We've rebuilt nearly 200 at this point. In our progress has been slowed down by COVID. Otherwise, that number would be higher. But I mean, we've got a fairly sophisticated apparatus for responding to disasters, and so obviously. Hurricane Harvey did not catch us by surprise. We knew it was coming, and we were positioning all of our resources and assets in order to have impact as quickly as possible. But also, tracking its path and its strength, and trying to make assessments prior to landfall for what the damage would be. You mentioned, one of the things that was unique about Harvey is it hit Rockport and Port Aransas as a Category 4 or 5, I can't remember which, and caused massive amounts of wind damage before bouncing off, being pushed off by a low pressure system, and then crawling up the coast, coming inland over Texas, where it sat for 96 hours blocked from moving further inland and dissipating in strength by a low pressure system hovering over North Texas. And that 96 hours, it's estimated that something on the order of 60 trillion gallons of water were dropped in Clay County, where Houston is. And I think I did the math for my book, and I can't remember what the exact number is. It's something like the equivalent of 15,000 New Orleans Superdomes of water. So if you can imagine, 15,000 buckets the size of the New Orleans Superdome dropped in Clay County in that time, it gives you a sense for how much water that was. So it was nearly unprecedented. We quickly moved in. We typically don't typically do swift water rescue. Mm-hmm. It's a highly technical role and function. It's usually filled by fire departments, National Guard, Coast Guard, things like that. But we saw this unprecedented announcement from the police chief in Houston saying, hey, we're calling on all private citizens that have a boat, shallow draft boat, to put their boats in the water and help rescue their neighbors. Think about that for a second. Think about how extraordinary that request for a public official to ask citizens to put their life. I mean, this is an extraordinarily dangerous activity. Downed power lines, you run that shallow draft boat over a fire hydrant, you capsize, you get swept away.
Especially that shows you just doing it at night too.
Yeah, it shows you how crazy that need was. And so when we heard that, we'd kind of been on standby for it. We knew who some of our credentialed and technical swift boat rescue specialists were internally. And so we immediately slapped together a team of a couple dozen vets who were mostly now firefighters, rescue swimmers from the Navy, things like that. We bought 8 boats, something like that, and had them in the water within 24 hours. So that just kind of gives you a sense for how this thing kicked off. But if as you then move forward over the next 100 days, Team Rubicon deployed about 2,000 veterans from across the country down into the greater Houston area. Not really focused on the city of Houston itself, but focusing on the outlying communities up and down the coast, as far south as Rockport, as far north and east as Beaumont, really trying to identify the smaller communities that weren't going to have the same amount of resources as Houston proper, which made for a huge logistical challenge. You can imagine trying to supply and manage the operations of 2,000 people across 9 forward operating bases. It's not a fly by the seat of your pants, operational planning endeavor, but we're very fortunate. We've got an amazing operations team based out of Dallas, specifically Grand Prairie, Texas, who oversees that stuff. And they did a great job, knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, no, I just would like to say, on behalf of the people of Texas, I'm originally from the Katy area, and Katy was affected pretty badly by it. And the overwhelming response, like you said, from citizens who tried to come in and provide some sort of relief, assistance, whatever that's swift boat rescue, or showing up at a food bank and bringing food and water and shelter was really just incredible. I think it lifted the spirits of all of our folks here in Texas. How did, when people ask you, why disaster response? Why do you continue to rush into some of the most difficult places in the world to provide aid and to provide service? What is about your desire to serve people, as well as those who are working alongside you, that continue to pull you in that direction to serve those in need?
Yeah, I mean, I think I grew up being service oriented. I grew up in the Midwest. It was just kind of a part of what you did. You helped your neighbors. You did something for the community. And part of that was growing up in the church. Part of that was how I was raised. Part of that, I think, was probably just innate. I joined the military because I wanted to serve my country. Listen, I'm really proud of my military service. I served 4 years in the Marine Corps, as you said in the introduction. I think you're a Marine as well. So Semper Fi.
Bye.
But during my tours overseas, I realized that there are some problems in this world that can be solved with a gun. There are a lot of problems in this world that can't be, and I think that really forced a perspective shift on me. And I realized that again, 2 hard tours, Anbar Province in the infantry, Afghanistan's Helmand Valley as a scout sniper. I understood that we need to take a holistic approach to the world. And, when I came home, I knew when I was getting out of the Marine Corps, I knew that my time in the military was going to be done. Again, I was proud of my service. I would do it again. But I didn't want war to define my life. And I just felt like it was starting to a little bit. But I still wanted to serve in some capacity. And so with that perspective that I'd gained overseas with, really what drove some of the world's challenges, I think I was open to opportunities to continue to serve.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't quite know where I was going to find it. And, the fairly well-documented story of the founding of Team Rubicon is the Haiti earthquake, which happened probably 60 days after I got out of the Marine Corps. Again, no intention of starting a humanitarian relief organization, but in seeing that disaster unfolding, I felt like the skills and experiences that I'd gained in the military would be well suited for that type of environment. And so, kind of spontaneously responded to help, confirmed my hypothesis that, having been in the infantry helped me to operate in that disaster zone. And we really took off from there. And I think what we have tapped into in these veterans who are so eager to continue this, to serve, is this vein of, military service is noble and it's necessary, but it's not necessarily the apex of service, right? Like there's service can be noble in all shapes and forms. And people may come to the conclusion that their time serving in the military is done, but their time serving their country isn't over. And so I think that that's kind of the vein that we've tapped into with Team Rubicon.
No, I certainly think you have. And I'm interested. I think I got kind of caught up in our football discussion. I didn't actually get a chance to actually talk about your military service. So I appreciate you kind of backfilling some of that information there. I certainly felt the same thing when I got out of the military, is like, where is my next opportunity to serve? But organizations like yourself are actually the ones who are providing an opportunity to fill that void and bring a sense of purpose. And really what I think is use the skill sets and the drive and actually have practical application within their community. But to talk about when you got out of the military real quick and before Team Rubicon was founded, did you have a sense, an idea of who you wanted to become, what you wanted to do, any sort of blueprint about what you wanted life to be like after the military when you got out of the Marine Corps?
No, I just knew that I didn't want to go back to war, so I think that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. That had always been something that I was interested in. I'd done entrepreneurial things before, but being an entrepreneur is not like a thing. That's not a career. An entrepreneur is nothing until he or she has an idea that they're actually executing against. And so, you can want to be an entrepreneur all day long, but if you don't have an idea, you're actually nothing. Yeah. And so, my concept was just to go to business school, get my MBA, wait for that opportunity to strike me in the face, or find the person that had a great opportunity and convince them that I was a worthwhile member of their team. But then of course the earthquake happened, and I kind of found that opportunity, or I guess I should say it found me, and I probably didn't realize it at the time for what it was, but it certainly has proven to be the entrepreneurial journey I was looking for.
Yeah. So let's kind of fast forward up to the last couple months where Team Rubicon, along with several other really stellar national veterans organizations, have teamed up for the Veterans Coalition for Vaccination. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what you're doing and the other veteran service organizations, which y'all are doing to help vaccinations?
Yeah, well, a year ago, Team Rubicon, like every other organization on the planet, realized that COVID-19 was real and that it was going to, be a disaster unlike we'd really seen in 100 years in this country. And so we very quickly began pivoting our operations to focus on how we could enter the fight against COVID-19, which, is not a disaster in the traditional context that most people think of it, but has all of the same challenges that a hurricane or a tornado or a flood present, limited information, limited resources, complex operational planning, all of those. And so, those things being core competencies of ours, we felt like we could bring them to bear. And so over the last year, we've done everything from, support hundreds of food banks across the country with volunteers and operational support, to launch and operate mobile testing sites throughout the Western U.S. to deploying hundreds of medics to Navajo Nation to support their healthcare system, and literally everything in between, on top of meeting our core mission of responding to all the hurricanes that hit, the southern Gulf Coast last year in a COVID environment. But late last year, we realized that it was going to be a miracle that we were going to have multiple viable vaccine candidates. But we also came to the conclusion that it didn't seem like there was much of a plan for distribution. And even in the presence of a suitable plan, there was going to be a massive shortfall in manpower to execute a plan. And so we began planning for how we could help to meet that manpower need, and began piloting vaccine support across nearly a dozen sites back in December when the vaccines first became approved. We've since supported about 50 sites across the country. We've supported about 300,000 vaccinations in that time, with a plan to scale to about 500 sites. Now, we knew that Team Rubicon alone could not scale with our current manpower to 500 sites. We knew we had the operational planning and expertise, but we would need a groundswell of other people to assist in the execution. And so we pulled together this coalition, the Veterans Coalition for Vaccination. It's made up of the leading post 9/11 veteran service organizations, groups like the Mission Continues, Team Red, White, and Blue, SVA, which I know you're familiar with, Wounded Warrior Project, Travis Manion Foundation, IAVA, groups like that, and tapping into the collective constituency of all of them to help meet that need. And there's a couple of interesting things for why that made sense. One, veterans are really good at executing, right? You give them a mission, you give them a role, you give them a function, they're going to do it. They're going to do it well. They're going to do it diligently, and they're not going to become complacent in the execution of it, which is really important in an infectious disease outbreak, to not be complacent.
Yeah.
Second thing,
wear your PPE properly, and
it's things we made fun of when we were in, but that stuff really matters when in a moment like this, and veterans certainly know how to do it. The other thing is, veterans maintain the highest degree of trust and confidence of the American population, more so than any demographic that we have, more than scientists, more than politicians, more than journalists, more than teachers, more than police, more than anybody. And so how do we tap into that trust and confidence at a moment when 30 to 40% of Americans are indicating they don't trust the vaccine and they won't get it? And how do we use them as leaders in their communities to encourage their neighbors to get this vaccine? Because it's not ultimately about you, it's about your country, and it's about, protecting those around you. And I think that's a powerful message for veterans to convey, and it's something that we wanted to tap into.
Yeah, I appreciate you acknowledging that too, because I certainly think that for those who may be skeptical, unsure, or maybe doubting some of the efficacy of the vaccines, I think, like you said, to be able to lend your credibility and to lend your organization and say, hey, we want to be a part of the solution, come follow us, is a way that will help, I think, the nation as a whole, hopefully move beyond this pandemic and provide what I think is a solution. I think people are looking for solutions, and they're looking for people like Team Rubicon and people like yourself to provide those solutions. So I appreciate the hard work that you guys are doing on that, and even as well as what you just talked about, some of the messaging, right? How do you message your neighbors to make sure that they are comfortable getting the vaccine, so that we can get it and hopefully return to somewhat of a normal life here in the next 6 months or so. I think we're all
let's hope.
Do that, huh?
Let's hope. I mean, the preeminent tactic right now is speed. Right. The faster that we can reach herd immunity, the more likely it is that we can choke off any of these mutant variant strains that could really threaten a second wave pandemic, even with all the vaccines, right? So it's so critical that we choke off the lifeblood of COVID-19 by not allowing it to have hosts in which it can mutate. Like, this sounds like a sci-fi novel, but it's actually pretty simple, right? And so we have to rapidly roll out this vaccine, because if people can't get infected, it cannot mutate and threaten us again, right? And so I hope people understand that, but the stakes are really high.
There's a lot that I kind of want to dive into here real quick, but if you wouldn't mind maybe telling me some of the lessons that you have learned from a leadership perspective when your organization and what you do is dependent on building relationships, being in person, being right next to someone, and your organization, along with even ours, including at the GLO, when you're not able to be together, you learn about how to lead your organization. You learn about the ability to communicate effectively of what your mission is going to be. You learn about how to pivot. And then, as you just alluded to, you guys were doing tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, and earthquakes. And then you made the decision and your team pivoted towards fighting COVID-19. Can you talk about the lessons that you've learned as a leader over the past year?
Man, I'll tell you, I'll start by saying I wish I would have learned more. I mean, I will admit that I have really found my own personal limitations as a leader in a remote environment, and really discovered just how much of an in-person leader that I am. But I'll talk about a couple of things that we tried to focus on. One is, don't assume that everybody understands what's going on, right? Like, I think there's numerous old communications mantras about, tell somebody, something as many times as you think it's going to take for them to understand, and then tell them it 10 more times, right? Like, you have to have this drumbeat of communication, whether that's, hey, what are we doing? Or, hey, where are we going? Why? All of those things, but also things like re-emphasizing the things that you don't know, right? Acknowledging, hey, we don't know when we're going to return to the office.
Right.
And not just say that once 12 months ago when we first went work from home, but to continue to say, guys, this is a moving target, to the extent that you can narrow in on, like, hey, it won't be before Q3 of 2020. Okay, now it's not going to be before Q2 of 2021, but continuing to acknowledge, what's going on, what you do know, and then I think just as importantly, continuing to acknowledge what you don't know. The second thing that I would say, and I really saw this play out in the opposite way early with many leaders, is you have to be willing to confront the brutal facts of what is going on. I think a lot of leaders, political leaders, organizational leaders, corporate leaders, they took this approach of like, let's not cause panic. Let's try to downplay what's happening here. And I think that was a real disservice to their constituents, whether they were employees, whether they were voters, whether they were anything. We took the approach of, hey, we don't know what's going on. So one, we were transparent and vulnerable and humble enough to acknowledge that we didn't have the answers. But two, we think it's going to be really, really bad. And we think it's going to get worse before it gets better. But here's what we're going to do to protect our business, to protect you as employees, and to protect our community. And we promise that along the way, as we learn more, we will reevaluate everything that we're telling you now, but we're not going to sugarcoat what we think is going to happen. Hope will not be our strategy here. And that's a thing that the military, consistently says, hope is not a strategy. And like, that was kind of the mantra that we took. We weren't going to sit around and hope that it wasn't bad, hope that it wasn't as deadly as the flu, hope that it wasn't as infectious as the flu. We said, hey, the early indications are that this is really deadly and it's really infectious, and we're going to act under that assumption, and we're going to take drastic measures early to ensure the sustainability of our business, the safety of our employees, and the efficacy of the impact that we can continue to have in our community, but under these new protocols that we're going to have to develop.
Yeah, that's I'm glad that you brought that up about, that's a difficult two parallels, right? We think this is going to be really bad, but not being able to create a panic, right? And that ability to communicate those two things, I think, is something that I think maybe those in the military are comfortable with. You're comfortable with saying, somebody telling you this is going to be tough. We don't know what it's going to be like when you get there. These are the best tools and the best knowledge that we have to give you. But if you have not been in that situation before, that is those two things of how do you tell people something is going to be really bad, but also get them to not freak out. That can be a difficult conversation for leadership to have.
Yeah, I mean, listen, another military mantra: panic is contagious, right? So if you're communicating that with panic in your voice and in tone and panic in your eyes, then your people are going to panic. But if you can communicate it soberly with conviction and give them even the slightest belief that you're going to make it through, then people, the panic is contagious, but so is courage, right? And so, you have to be, stern-faced, clenched jaw, steely-eyed when you deliver that message. But if you deliver it, then one, people know that you trust them with the truth, right? And it's amazing what gets unlocked when people feel like, hey, I'm being treated like an adult here. They're trusting me with the real sobering assessment of what's going on. And they're inviting me to be a part of the solution because they're acknowledging that they don't know. Like that creates this flywheel of trust that is really, really powerful for engendering teams to leadership and to the plan.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate again, I want to come back and say how much I appreciate you kind of shedding light on your approach to it, your communication strategy, as well as being a solution-oriented organization who's going to go help with vaccines and who's going to take care of the sick and the vulnerable. I want to pivot to your book, Once a Warrior. And for those who may be unfamiliar with the book, Tom Brokaw called it the book that America needs right now. And if you don't mind, I want to talk about the writing process for you. But before I do that, I actually wanted to read a passage out of the book because it resonated with me, and I think it'll resonate with our audience here. And then I want to get some of your feedback from it. It says, "But what if we reframed what it means to be a veteran? What if instead of allowing our sons and daughters to simply fade away, we asked them to come home and build a legacy that would strengthen the foundation of our nation?" And that line right there is exactly what I hope this show is about, which is encouraging people to continue to lead and continue to serve. Was writing Once a Warrior, was it something that maybe you wrote down in a journal over time and then decided to put together? Or was it a conscious effort to sit down over a 3-month period and write out your memoir of military service and time as CEO of Team Rubicon?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that the wartime stories were journaled around when they happened. And so, it was really interesting to go back through those because the way I framed those experiences in the moment was dramatically different, not in terms of what happened, but how I felt about it 10 years or 12, 15 years later, as I was editing it and rewriting it and revisiting it. So it was really fascinating to see the reactions of a 25-year-old Marine to seeing his friend blown up and bleeding to death, then, a 37-year-old who's now has, a decade's more experience in life and perspective to go back to that and revisit that moment in that way. But what was interesting was so much of that book is less about the stories and more about how you stitch them together with what they mean. And I have to admit that I didn't understand what they all meant until I wrote them and looked at them, and then was able to put that layer throughout the book that kind of pulled them together into at least one Marine's, veteran's perspective of what it all meant. And that was a really fascinating process because I don't know that I'd ever come to any conclusions. And I'll admit there's really no hard and fast conclusions in the book, but, really kind of a framework for how I now look at my life, the wars I fought, the friends I lost, and the service since. None of that was kind of preordained when I first sat down to write it. It came through the process, which was really fascinating.
That's what I was going to ask you. Something that I think is so powerful are the stories that we tell ourselves, and the stories that maybe you were telling yourself when you were 25, or the stories that you tell yourself after somebody you serve with or a veteran takes their life, or you start looking at those narratives. How were you able to take those difficult experiences in life and use them as a positive, as opposed to letting them pull you down? And if I can ask a follow-up to that, was writing the book cathartic for those experiences?
Yeah, I mean, to your second question, absolutely cathartic. Yeah, and the whole process was was really interesting. Again, it forced me to strip away some of the defenses that we as veterans put up when we think about our experiences, right? We've become really adept. If you saw combat, if you lost friends, if you had that type of experience overseas, you put up all of these psychological and emotional defenses against those memories. You create justifications for what happened. And what's really interesting is if you take the time to deliberately peel those back, some of them are legitimate and they remain in place. Some of them, you realize them for what they were. And you say, well, this was clearly a coping mechanism. And now, if I take a more critical eye at what happened, I can look more objectively at my experience. And again, I think it's always important to emphasize, I'm proud of my service and I would do it again. But I can also look back at my service and say, and ask the hard questions. Should we have still been in Iraq or Afghanistan in the manner that we were in 2007 and 2008? Mm-hmm. Some people want to say, hell yes, and we should stay there. I think that's often less informed by some nuanced understanding of national security strategy and more by wanting to believe that when they were there, that it meant something and it really, really mattered.
I actually can kind of resonate with you on that. My second deployment was to Afghanistan, and it was actually in 2011. And we started off in Helmand province, and we were only there for a month. And we moved out to Camp Nole. And we moved out to the western edge of the country, and we were doing essentially just FOB security on Delaram 2. It was a big base in the middle of what felt like Mars, right? We were just we were out there by ourselves, and I felt some of the same tensions, right? Like personally, I want to be here because my brothers in arms are here, right? Yeah. Like I want to be here because I want to be here with my guys. But then to your point, you start thinking like I remember. I think it was General Petraeus came through and talked about like, yeah, we're not sure how much longer we're going to have troops here. And there is kind of that push and pull that you feel when you're serving and then also afterwards of trying to justify either what you experienced or kind of the trauma that you experienced or just like how valuable it was. I think when we were in Iraq in 2008, 2009, I served with the PSD battalion for a battalion commander, and I felt like I was on the front of the newspaper every day. I mean, our battalion commander was going out and meeting with the mayor, the police chief, with the local sheikhs to make sure that the Iraqi people could have their city back, the city of Fallujah back, after Marines had come through in Phantom Fury and cleared out all the bad guys. And it was like, wow, this is incredible. Like this is actually working. But then, like you said, once you see the rise of ISIS, however many years later, it does leave you with kind of a frustrating feeling. And I certainly kind of agree and can sympathize with that push and pull of being so proud of something you did, but then also trying to look at it from a macro level and being somewhat frustrated with it, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, you pointed to one of the what was one of the hardest chapters in the book to write, which was this exploration of. In part, an exploration of like what the rise of ISIS meant for people who could point to Iraqi democracy as justification for their sacrifice or their friend's sacrifice. And when that evaporated, with the rise of ISIS in 2014, 2015, the Mosul falling, Fallujah falling, I hadn't been relying on that justification for my own sanity, but I had plenty of friends that I served with who did, and I saw their health, their emotional well-being crumble, and it was really sad to watch.
Yeah. I want to talk about a different day, real quick, if you don't mind. I want to talk about the day that you were at the ESPYs in 2018, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that's out there in Southern California in LA.
Yep.
And if I may just mention this, you were awarded the 2018 Pat Tillman Award for service at the ESPYs. Can you talk to us about what that day felt like for you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was a really humbling, full circle moment. where things just kind of made sense for the first time in a long time. I don't think I mentioned it at the beginning when you asked me how I got to the Marine Corps, but certainly a major driver of my decision to enlist was Pat Tillman's death, which took place right before my senior football season at Wisconsin. And, as a football player, I always felt, particularly tied to his story and legacy. Not because I was trying to live up to it, just because, I felt like I knew who he was in some weird way. And, to then, loop back, 15 years later, 14 years after his death, I guess, and be receiving that award in his honor for the work that had happened because his sacrifice had inspired me to join and serve was really humbling. And, again, I said it kind of made sense to the universe for me a little bit. I kind of was able to reflect back on it with, I guess, a little bit of pride and in a hope that it had all been worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly can again empathize and appreciate that admiration of Pat Tillman. I can remember in high school. I guess I'm a few years younger than you, or a couple years younger than you, but I remember having the picture of Pat Tillman as he's running onto the field, the Arizona Cardinals, and he has his helmet. And I think I cut that out of Sports Illustrated. Like I cut off that front cover of the Sports Illustrated after he passed away, and I had that on my wall. And I certainly remember the impact of Pat Tillman, I think, on our entire generation. Yeah.
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, he was he was an iconic figure even before he joined the Army. I mean, he was just a different breed in the NFL early, which was just fun to watch. And, my admiration for Pat actually goes back to when he was at Arizona State. I grew up cheering for the Nebraska Cornhuskers. And one year they went down to play ASU in Tempe, and he just demolished their offense. Like, he was a one-man wrecking crew. And I'm like, who the fuck is this guy, this undersized linebacker in the Pac-10 who's destroying, at the time, it was the best offense in the country. And so I followed him out of admiration through the rest of his time at ASU and then into the pros. And I mean, what a player, man. And one of the coolest things over the last couple of years has been getting to know his Marie, who was his wife, and she's now remarried and has a beautiful family. But I just remember the first time I met her, and then as I got to know her a little bit more, thinking to myself how small the world really is. Never would have imagined that would happen.
Absolutely. So one last question here about the book. One, thank you for writing this book. Thank you for taking the time to go through it. Where can we find this book, and where can we go pick it up so that our audience can kind of hear a little bit more in depth than what we were able to cover today about your life as well as your military service and leadership with Team Rubicon?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. The book's available just about anywhere books are sold. Any of the online retailers. It's actually gotten pretty good traction in independent bookstores too. So if you're kind of an anti-Amazon listener, you want to go support your local business, it's probably there. And then if you're an audiobook person, I actually read the book for the Audible version, and a lot of people have really liked that experience.
I appreciate that. Well, Jake, we're going to leave it here. Is there anything else that you would like to leave our audience with before we close it out?
Well, I would just revisit the part of our conversation from earlier where we talked about the work that we're doing with the Veterans Coalition for Vaccination. If any of your listeners feel compelled to get out and help, and maybe haven't, identified the easiest or best way to do it, we'd love to have you. You can go to teamrubiconusa.org, figure out how to volunteer there. Or you can go to the veteranscoalition.org and find a way to sign up. It's easy, it's simple, and I promise you, you'll go to bed that night knowing that however many vaccinations you help deliver that day, it's that many hundreds or thousands of people whose life you may have saved and helped protect. And you're not going to get many opportunities in life to be able to go to bed at night and reflect back on a day like that.
Amen, brother. Semper Fi, I appreciate you being on the show with us today and sharing your life story as well as the great work of you and the folks at Team Rubicon.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Sir. On behalf of Chairman George P. Bush and our staff at the Texas Veterans Land Board, we will see you back here next Monday. So long.
Follow us on Instagram at Voices of Vets, on Twitter at Voice of Veterans, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Voices of Veterans. To hear more, please visit voicesofveterans.org. Join us in sharing the success stories of Texas veterans. Thank you for joining us for the Next Gen Warrior podcast.